Has anyone known a killer before they killed? What were they like?
I graduated high school with Dr. Death, Chris Dunge. He was an asshole. He was charming with teachers and people who could benefit him. He was awful to everybody else. I didn't see it, but one or more awkward and vulnerable classmates said he bullied him relentlessly, and I believe it. He was easily irritated, and if you got on his nerves he would really lose his cool. Remarkably mean. And people would just shrug their shoulders and say that's just how Chris is.
A few years ago I hired a father-son handyman team to help me get my house ready to put on the market. Among other things, my outside doorknobs were in bad shape, so they installed new ones. The dad seemed pretty nice, even did a little bit for free. On their third and last day at my house, he was pretty fired up about a big job they were starting the next day. 3 days later he killed his new clients because they were unhappy with his work. A neighbor saw what happened and ran into her house and hid. He kicked her door in and shot her too. I was terrified until he was caught.
My little sister dated a guy when she was in high school who ended up murdering a couple he owed money to for heroin. This dude beat them with a fucking baseball bat and hammer. He almost got the death sentence, but ended up with life in prison with no possibility of parole. He was a seemingly nice, polite teenager. I used to drive him and my sister around for various dates and things. He was quiet, but not oddly so. He just seemed like a normal teenage boy. Edit. Sorry, I just got some clarification on some details. The murder weapons were actually a microphone stand and a hammer. He is eligible for parole after 51 years. This happened in 2015.
He was really nice and I had gone to K-12 with him. Never knew him to be the kind of person that would even get upset. Then I get a text a couple years ago asking, "Do you know about X? Him and his brother killed their parents." Edit, I'm out of the loop on this one. Younger brother was cleared. He was an asshole. I'm not surprised he killed somebody. He killed a 65-year-old man in a revenge drive by shooting. He shoot at the wrong house. The guy he intended to kill didn't even live in that neighborhood.
I went to high school with a girl who poisoned her father. No one knew until she confessed a year later watching a Shakespeare play in college. She was a little weird in school, but I didn't think she was capable of that.
My family bought a house from a man who flipped houses for a living back when I was growing up. He was a nice man, married with grown kids. He would often come over for dinner and help with minor repairs around the house. We moved away a few years later and he wanted to buy the house back. Luckily, it was a cash deal because soon after it all went through, he was arrested for child porn. When the cops raided his house, there was no sign of his wife. Upon looking into it, no one had seen or heard from her in months. Turns out, he had murdered her and buried her in their backyard. I sat next to that man at the dinner table as a child. Still haunts me.
I played basketball with a guy a few years ago in high school, tried to find him on Facebook and turns out he was being tried for murder. Apparently he and some of his friends were looking for pot money, so they broke into this guy's house and somehow the guy ended up dead. Everyone in his group said he pulled the trigger but he denied it. Maybe he did it, maybe he didn't, but I can say that he was a genuinely nice person when I knew him. Never would have expected him to kill someone, but I guess my mom was right about hanging out with the wrong crowd.
There was this kid that would sit next to me in chemistry during my sophomore year of HS. Some days he'd be totally out of it with his head down, other days he'd be answering every question in class. On the worse end he'd sometimes get up and run out of the classroom. Our TA would then spend most of the period trying to find him. His life was definitely shit by the looks of it. Fast forward a year later, it turned out he got hired by some kid outside of school as a hitman. Kid wanted his parents dead. He brought a hammer to the kid's house, injuring his mom, but he got fought off by the kid's dad. He ran off but got caught at a nearby gas station. He got a 16-year sentence about 2 weeks ago.
Boy, a couple years my minor in high school, he was always the outcast in his classes. He dressed funny, talked funny, and said disturbing things that some recall as threats, mostly to the girls of the school. After graduation, he ended up butchering a homeless woman he was, I can't say living together or in a relationship with. I am not sure what their status was. Either way, kitchen knife drained her into the tub. In court he showed no remorse and was proud to have finally ended someone's life. His father was my professor in university. He took it very hard.
Yes, was hired at the same time as him. Worked right next to him for several years. He was one of those stoner guys always bragging about the parties he went to. He was a little obnoxious in a bro sort of way, so I always skipped hanging out with him after work. After I left that job a little while later, he killed his ex-girlfriend while her 5-year-old was in the apt watching TV, took the kid on a road trip to Texas, and smothered her on Christmas morning and left her in a suitcase on the side of the road.
My sister was killed by her fiancé. He was, well, normal. Took good care of her during recovery from surgery. A bit weird, but nothing stands out. Weird as in opposite interests and shy, where my sister was outgoing. Never would have expected it from him. Until O had to clean out their place and found a bunch of guns and crap load of knives and shit.
My best friend's older brother killed her stepmom, strangled her and burned the house down. He was just like any other teenage older brother. A bit rebellious but nothing out of the ordinary. He was kinda goth and liked heavy metal and had dark humor. He played GoldenEye with us and always let me use the see-through purple controller. He teased his little sister just like any brother would. One time he took us for a car ride and did donuts in a church parking lot while blasting a big Shiny Tunes album, and it was really fun. Nothing ever indicated what he would do later in life.
I worked with a guy that murdered his GF. He was a cool dude. I sat with him a lot on my lunch breaks. We talked about football, school, life, etc. Pretty normal stuff. Never would think he was a killer. He was not an aggressive person at all.
One of my parents' friends used to come around all the time. He was probably only 21. Nicest guy ever. Type of guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. A couple of years later he moved and we seen him on the news for murder. Turned out he got on the ice and his girlfriend convinced him to kill her ex with her. They then buried him in concrete. Only reason they got caught was because they wrote their fucking names in the concrete.
One of my best friends when I was stationed at Fort Bragg ended up getting into some sort of drunken altercation later on in his career at Fort Hood, went back to his house to retrieve a pistol, went back to the party and shot a dude. It was absolutely insane to me when I heard about it because he had never shown any tendencies towards violence when I hung out with him pretty much every day for over 2 years. Probably drank a little too much, but he was always just a good dude raising a good family. Last time I talked to him was 3 days before his trial. He ended up changing his plea to guilty to receive 25 years instead of life. He's at Leavenworth now, going on probably 7 or 8 years now. Feel bad for the family of the guy he shot. He was a medically retired vet and didn't deserve to be gunned down like that. As much as the murderer was my friend, he gets to go home one day. The guy he shot never will.
I was friends with a guy who was accused of physical abusing his son. He went through the courts to fight it. The ex-girlfriend finally admitted she made it up because he cheated on her. He ended up killing her then himself.
My neighbor's father murdered his entire family and then killed himself shortly before he was to be indicted over a Ponzi-esque scheme. I knew the whole family well. The dad was always a little weird and would do things like wear a full 3-piece suit to a child's soccer game. Never showed any signs of being violent though. The mother and 2 daughters were wonderful people. It was a real tragedy.
I dated a guy who later stabbed his mother to death. He was psychotic and abusive, and I fled the state because I was afraid he was going to kill me. I found out years later that he murdered his mother just a few months after I left him. He's still in prison. It's been 20 years and I still have nightmares about him, and I still feel a little sick talking about it.
Our roommate killed a 16-year-old over some money he thought he stole. I have to testify in court soon actually.
kid was in my dad's Weeblo troupe, and hung out with my brother. Really arrogant and mouthy. Biggest thing he did in junior high was when he was in 7th grade, he dismantled the toilets in one of our school's upstairs bathrooms. A couple of years later, his mom passed, and he found her. Started to get in trouble. Theft. Then fighting. A few years later, he raped a girl, went to jail. After he was released, he wound up killing 7 people.
I didn't know her well, but I attended a wedding with a member of the bridal party some years back. The maid of honor seemed like a cheery, funny person. I had a good time at the wedding and we chatted a bit. About 6 months later the Mo shot and killed her husband. I don't know if I ever found out why.
High school classmate murdered a college student at random and was given the death penalty. Executed in Florida. He had a difficult home life but was always the life of the party.
He was seemingly a really nice dude. He worked in our college dining hall. Always friendly, polite, kind to the students, and he made me smile or chuckle more than once. It turns out he stabbed a homeless woman over 24 times and was arrested for murder. I suppose some people can just snap or are really good at hiding true nature. Not sure which category he falls into.
I went to high school with a kid who was the awkward kid. He tried to fit in, but he tried too hard. He was physically inept, overweight, tried to fit in by being goth or punk, but it wasn't quite right. Bad haircut, no fashion sense. Just an odd duck, and the misery on him was palpable because of the shitty way people treated him. I felt sorry for him, that is, until after high school. He was working alone at his parents' children's clothing store when a woman and her daughter came in. He locked them in, raped the woman and then murdered her and her 19-month-old baby. He was caught, tried and convicted to 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, and as far as I know is still serving those sentences.
I used to live in a shared house with 3 other dudes. This one particular guy used to go to work every day, come home, go to the club for a few beers. I left the house. Several years later a young lass was stabbed to death not far from where I was working. Police came in the next day and asked if anyone recognized the photo. Lo and behold, it was a dude I used to live with.
My manager at work was a pretty chill, nerdy guy. He was really nice to talk to and a fun boss. Then he smothered his infant son and it kind of messed me up for a while. This was a guy that I almost considered a friend. Everyone at work was shocked and didn't know how to handle or feel about it. Of course, we talked about it when there weren't any customers around, but most of it was the expected "I can't believe manager did this" talk.
I once spent some time with some rough guys growing up who ran a gang, if you want to call it that. They sold most of the drugs in our town. I spent my time with that group of people because they accepted you no matter who you were. Our initiation to get into the group was to beat the shit out of each other in the front yard of their house. It was considered a sign of respect to each other. Anyways, one time we were at a party and these 2 dudes invited this guy to come up to the hills with them. This party was out in the sticks, middle of nowhere, and I remember while I was there seeing one of them grab a baseball bat before they got into their truck and left with the guy. I left the party a little bit later, but I heard from some other people in the group that when they came back it was just the 2 dudes and that their baseball bat had blood on it. I never saw the guy they took up there again. I don't know what they did to him, and it could be that he wasn't even from our town, that maybe nothing happened to him and the people who told me about it were seeing things, but I stopped hanging out with those guys shortly after that.
I used to play hacky sack at school with a kid that ended up meeting an older gentleman on Craigslist for gay sex, met with him, killed him and burnt his house down with his dead body inside. Seemed like an okay dude, no red flags to speak of really.
My aunt was a surgical technician who worked closely with Michael Swengo, the killer doctor at Ohio State's hospital. She said he had very poor bedside manner and didn't seem even slightly concerned when his patients were in pain. He would often bring in food for the other staff and people would mysteriously get sick after. He eventually got exposed after the roommate of one of his patient's victims heard him inject a lethal dose of medication into her IV and told the woman, "When it gets your other arm, you will be dead." By the time he was found out, he had already fled the state. My aunt and several of her coworkers were interviewed by what they were told was the state medical board, but it was actually the OSU board of directors. There was a large cover-up from the university to protect their university, and Swango was allowed to kill over 100 more patients before he was caught. There's a really good book about Swango and the cover-up called Blind Eye. My aunt was interviewed for the book and said it is the most accurate description of the killings and the politics that allowed him to keep killing.
20 years ago, I worked with a guy, super nice sweet guy. We both worked in a kitchen. He wouldn't hurt a fly, and on the odd occasion a bug would find its way into our workspace, he'd gently shoo it out. One weekend, he went to a party. I wasn't there, but heard what happened, which was he was drugged. In the midst of that, he woke up, semi-conscious but paralyzed due to the effects, being raped by some guy. He passed out, and when he woke up in the morning, the rapist was passed out next to him. He went to the kitchen, found a knife, and slit the guy's throat. He served 8 years. I testified on his behalf as a character witness and all that, but it was premeditated and not ruled self-defense. He got out 10 years ago, but prison really changed him. Hardened him up, as you can imagine. We still see each other time to time, but it's very different. He has an edge. I guess the issue is not how killing changed him, but prison.
My childhood neighbor and Sunday school teacher, children's church classes, recently murdered his wife in cold blood. He is like 70 years old. He always gave me the creeps and I could never figure out why. Once when my brother was around 15, he was over at their house with our mom helping this man's wife do some renovations on their house. The guy showed up and went off on my brother as if he were trying to get with his wife, when my bro was forced to be there by our mom to help this older lady. Odd. Fast forward to now, my dad works at the jail he's at. My parents were divorced, so my dad never knew him before. An elderly lady recently visited the killer in jail and had a health emergency while she was in the visiting cubicles, and my dad called the ambulance to help her or whatever. Later on, this guy shakes my dad's hand and looks right into his eyes with a seemingly genuine "thank you for saving this lady." My dad said he felt a chill run through his entire body and compared the guy's smile to the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Creepy.
Yes. A kid that was in my English class killed his girlfriend. He seemed like a normal friendly guy.
My ex-boyfriend's best friend in school ended up breaking into his girlfriend's house with another guy and beat her to death. I remember hanging out with him in 2 classes that my ex didn't have with us. He was really funny and a smart ass. He got me in trouble a lot for laughing during class. He was also good at drawing and coming up with raps. When I read the article about him years later, I was kind of shocked. Guess people just change.
My academic advisor murdered her husband this weekend. She always said she was single. She was really kind and totally didn't seem like the type. She canceled our class yesterday and was arrested today.
I was friends with a kid in elementary school and I would go over to his house to play Legos, etc. We sort of ended up in different groups by middle school and were just acquaintances in high school. He was a pretty normal kid, went to parties, graduated with a good GPA, etc. His parents were middle class and owned a home, etc. He ended up bashing his roommate's head in with a bat in 2016. The roommate had a dog and it was on its period. It was making a mess all around the house and he wouldn't clean it up. The roommate also neglected the dog and I guess my old Lego buddy had had enough. The guy was sleeping on the couch and he just went to town on his head with the bat. The eyewitness ran out of the house thinking he was next and said all he remembers is the guy's face was pretty much gone and only heard gurgling sounds as he fled. Crazy world.
When I was 10, had a friend from the next block over who had an older brother of 16 or 17. One night his brother had a fight with his mom over a bad report card from school. It escalated to him chasing his mom out of the house and shooting her with a rifle. I had met both his mom and his older brother, but in that way that 10-year-olds meet parents, much older brothers. Just passing through on our way to play or go ride bikes. His brother just seemed a brooding teenager that, in retrospect, smoked a lot of pot and had anger issues. Really didn't want to have anything to do with us cause we were lame. For some reason I think Sid from Toy Story with a cowboy hat. No, I did not hear the shot or the ensuing police stuff even though it happened maybe 50 yards away from my house. Brother ran, they caught him quickly, house went for sale the next week, never saw my friend again. Never found out his verdict, sentence. I was 10.
I knew this lady who worked at my parents' restaurant for a few years. She was pretty friendly, a bit loud, liked to drink, party and really into Latino men. That was a pretty standout thing about her since she talked about them so much. She had a young daughter. She later stabbed her friend to death over a guy. It's my understanding that her daughter did not live with her anymore at the time of the murder.
I knew a guy whose best friend beat someone to death. He got woken up by a phone call from his mate telling him about it and thought IJT was a sick joke. A few days later he got arrested as an accessory to murder and spent 6 years in jail. All because of a phone call. Poor guy had a real hard time trying to accept his mate's actions and the outcome for himself.